I have built things with these hands. A business, a home, a family. 44 years of marriage to a woman who was the finest person I have ever known. I raised a son, buried a wife, and kept going because that is what you do. That is what a man does. And then one afternoon I asked my daughter-in-law for a glass of water. I needed it to take my medication. My legs had been giving me trouble, nothing I couldn't manage, nothing that had stopped me from living my life. But that day she was closer to the kitchen. So I asked. She looked at me the way you look at something you've already decided to throw away. Go crawl and get it yourself, you crippled old man. My son was standing right there. He said nothing. Not one word. I got my own water. I took my pills. I sat back down, and I made a decision, not out of anger, not out of hurt, but out of something quieter and far more dangerous. Clarity. Because what she didn't know, what neither of them knew, was that I had been watching for weeks. The unopened bank letters. The phone calls that stopped the moment I walked into a room. The folder on the kitchen table already open to the page where I was supposed to sign my life away. That night, I heard them planning to send me to a nursing home. For his own good, she said. So I made one call, and by the time this story is over, you will understand exactly why my wife, even from beyond the grave, had already prepared for this moment. Stay with me. It gets so much better. My name is Gerald Hayes. I am 72 years old, a widower, and for 31 years I ran a small but honest HVAC business in this town. The kind of work that keeps families warm in winter and breathing in summer. The kind of work that nobody notices, until it stops. I built that business with Margaret's father, buried 2 employees I considered friends, and retired the year after my wife Helen was diagnosed, because some things matter more than a paycheck, and she was everything that mattered. I tell you this not because I want your sympathy, but because I want you to understand who I was before that afternoon. Not a fragile man, not a confused man, not a burden. A man who had spent 7 decades solving problems, showing up, and asking for very little in return. The morning it happened had started like most of my mornings since Helen passed, quiet, in the way that only a house with one person in it can be quiet. I had my coffee, I read the paper, and I did the exercises the physical therapist had given me for my left leg, which had been stiff since a fall on the back steps 14 months earlier. The fall had not been serious. The recovery had taken longer than expected, which my doctor said was normal at my age, and which I had accepted without complaint. I was not helpless. I moved slower than I once did, and some mornings the leg ached in a way that made me grip the counter when I stood, but I managed. I had always managed. Daniel and Olivia had moved in 6 months before Daniel's idea, he said, though I noticed it was Olivia who had already selected which room would become her home office before the conversation about moving in had fully concluded. I had agreed because Daniel is my son, and because the house is large, and because I was not yet ready to admit how quiet it had become. That was my first mistake, though I did not know it at the time. That afternoon I was sitting in the armchair near the front window when I realized I had left my medication on the kitchen counter and my water glass was empty. My leg was bothering me more than usual, a deep grinding ache that made the idea of standing feel like a negotiation between my body and my will. Olivia was in the kitchen. I could hear her moving around, the sound of cabinet doors, the refrigerator opening and closing. It seemed simple enough. I called to her. I asked if she would mind bringing me a glass of water so I could take my pill. The sound from the kitchen stopped. She appeared in the doorway a moment later, and the expression on her face was not irritation exactly. It was something more considered than that. It was the face of someone who had already decided a long time ago how much you were worth to them. Go crawl and get it yourself, she said. You crippled old man. Then she turned and walked back into the kitchen. Daniel was sitting on the couch 12 feet away from me. He had heard every word. I know this because I watched his jaw tighten and his eyes drop to the floor in the half-second after she said it. He did not look at me. He did not say her name. He did not say anything at all. He picked up his phone and began scrolling through it with the focused attention of a man who has decided that whatever is happening in the room around him is not his responsibility. I stood up. I walked to the kitchen. I filled my own glass, took my pill, and stood at the sink for a moment, looking out at the backyard, at the garden Helen had planted the year we moved in, which I had been trying to maintain ever since she was no longer here to tend it. The roses needed cutting. I had been meaning to get to them. I did not cry. I want to be very clear about that. What I felt was not grief, and it was not self-pity. What I felt was something I can only describe as recognition, the specific, settled feeling of a man who has just received the confirmation of something he already suspected, like hearing a diagnosis you had quietly been preparing for. I carried my water back to my chair and sat down and finished reading the paper. That night I could not sleep. This was not unusual. Sleep had been unreliable since Helen died, and I had made peace with the hours between 2 and 4 in the morning as my own particular kind of solitude. I was lying still in the dark when I heard their voices carrying down the hallway from the kitchen, not arguing. Calm and practical the way people sound when they are discussing arrangements that have already been made. Olivia's voice. "We can't keep doing this indefinitely." Daniel, something low, something I couldn't fully catch. Olivia again, "The place on Maplewood has availability. I spoke to them last week. It's the responsible thing, Daniel. It's for his own good." I lay there and let the words settle over me, the way cold water settles completely and all at once. And then I thought of something else. I thought of the bank envelope that had arrived 3 weeks ago, already opened, when I found it on the counter, resealed but not carefully enough. I thought of the phone call Olivia had ended the moment I stepped into the room, and the way she'd smiled at me immediately after, warm and seamless, as though the call had never happened. I thought of Daniel's eyes, and the way they had stopped meeting mine sometime in the past 2 months, and how I had told myself it was stress, it was the marriage, it was something I didn't need to understand. I understood it now. I did not panic. I did not lie there rehearsing arguments or calculating losses. I reached for the phone on my nightstand and I made one call, not because I was afraid and not because I felt alone, but because I had been watching long enough to know that what was coming would require more than silence. And because there was one person in this world who had known Helen almost as long as I had and who would know exactly what to do next. Margaret Doyle arrived at my front door at 7:15 the following morning, carrying a paper bag with 2 coffees and the expression of a woman who had already been thinking since before dawn. She had been Helen's closest friend for nearly 30 years. They met through the church auxiliary, bonded over a shared contempt for weak coffee and weak excuses, and remained inseparable until the very end. Helen used to say that Margaret was the sharpest person she had ever known, which was saying something because Helen herself was no one's fool. Margaret had spent 22 years as a paralegal before retiring, working primarily in estate law, and she carried that background the way some people carry faith, quietly, constantly, as a lens through which everything was filtered. She sat down at the kitchen table, pushed one of the coffees toward me and said, "Tell me everything, from the beginning. Leave nothing out because you think it's too small." So I did. I told her about the bank envelope, the one that had arrived addressed to me, opened and resealed, with just enough care to suggest that whoever had done it assumed I wouldn't notice. I told her about the withdrawal I had found when I checked my account online 2 weeks prior, a modest amount pulled from a secondary savings account Helen and I had kept for household repairs, the kind of transaction that looks entirely reasonable on its own. I told her about a conversation I had overheard in late September when Olivia had been on the phone with someone I didn't recognize, describing me to them. My confusion, my difficulty, my increasing inability to manage daily tasks. Words that bore no resemblance to my actual life. And I told her about the doctor's appointment notification that had arrived by mail scheduled in my name at a practice I had never visited with a physician I had never chosen. Margaret listened without interrupting. When I finished, she wrapped both hands around her cup and was quiet for a moment. "Gerald," she said, "what you are describing has a name. It is called elder financial abuse. And what they are building alongside it is a legal case to have you declared mentally incompetent. The financial piece creates the appearance of dependency. The incompetency filing hands them control. One supports the other." She looked at me steadily. "This is not carelessness. This is a process. And someone in that house knows exactly how it works." I had known something was wrong. Hearing it named with that kind of precision was a different experience entirely. Margaret told me the first thing I needed to do, not tomorrow, today, was contact Andrew Collins. Andrew had handled Helen's estate and the trust she established in the final years of her life. Margaret said Olivia would almost certainly move to reach him soon to begin laying down a version of events that served her purposes. I needed to get there first before that version had a chance to take root. Then she reached into her bag and set a small digital voice recorder on the table between us. It was compact enough to sit flat in a breast pocket without showing. She slid it toward me without ceremony. "Every day," she said. "Every conversation that happens in that house. You don't need to act on it immediately. You just need it running." I picked it up and put it in my pocket without argument. Then she outlined the rest of the strategy. I was to give them nothing that looked like resistance, no confrontations, no changed locks, no visible preparations. Instead, I was to appear exactly as they already believed me, to be slower, vaguer, slightly uncertain at the edges. Let them feel confident. Let them stop being careful. Confidence, Margaret told me, is what makes people reveal themselves completely. They stop watching their words when they believe the person in the room is no longer fully there. "You have been observing them," she said. "Now let them believe there is nothing left worth observing." I understood her precisely. There was a particular clarity to the plan that appealed to something in me, the same part that had spent 3 decades diagnosing problems other people had given up on finding the fault in the system that no one else had thought to look for. She looked at me across the table, and for just a moment I saw something in her face that reminded me of Helen, that quality of absolute stillness that belongs only to people who are entirely unafraid of what the truth might cost them. "If they believe you're already gone," Margaret said, "let them prove it." The days that followed Margaret's visit required a particular kind of discipline, not the discipline of action, but the discipline of stillness. I had spent my working life being the man who identified the problem and fixed it, who picked up the phone and made the call, and resolved the situation before it had time to settle into something permanent. What Margaret was asking me to do was the opposite of every instinct I had trained over 72 years. She was asking me to watch and wait and let things worsen on purpose. I will not pretend it came easily. What helped was having something to observe. And Olivia, once she believed I was no longer paying close attention, gave me a great deal to observe. The first clear demonstration came 3 days after my conversation with Margaret, when our neighbor Beverly stopped by to drop off a casserole dish she had borrowed in the fall. Beverly is a warm, uncomplicated woman in her late 60s who had known Helen and me for over a decade, and she had a habit of staying longer than she intended whenever she came to the door. I was settled in my armchair when Olivia answered the bell, and what happened next was something I can only describe as a transformation, not gradual but instant, the way a stage light changes when someone throws a switch. She became a different person entirely. Her voice softened, her posture opened. She touched Beverly's arm and guided her gently inside. And as she passed my chair, she rested her hand briefly on my shoulder and said with perfect warmth, "Beverly's here, Gerald. Isn't that lovely?" as though she were, introducing me to something I had been hoping for. She sat with Beverly in the living room and spoke about me with a tender, careful concern that I had never once heard her apply in private. My health, my loneliness, the burden of watching someone you love decline. Beverly listened and nodded and looked at me with soft eyes, and I looked back at her and smiled the slow, slightly unfocused smile of a man who was only partially following the conversation. She was too smooth. The words came too easily, landed too precisely in every pause. I had known salesmen who could work a room the way Olivia worked Beverly that afternoon, and what they all had in common was practice. You do not learn to perform grief and devotion with that kind of fluency unless you have performed it before. Daniel arrived home while Beverly was still there and fell into step beside Olivia with the ease of long rehearsal. He crouched beside my chair, spoke to me gently, and said the words I had been hearing from him with increasing frequency. "We just want what's best for you, Dad. You know that." The words themselves were reasonable. The tone was the problem, not unkind, but the careful tone of a man reciting something he had decided on in advance rather than something he was feeling in the moment. I nodded slowly and patted his hand, and he looked relieved in the way people look relieved when they believe a situation is proceeding according to plan. After Beverly left, Olivia's phone rang. She glanced at the screen and moved toward the back hallway, her voice dropping immediately to something private and familiar. "It's my brother," she said, to no one in particular, and then softer, almost to herself, with a small laugh. "Give me just a minute." She did not explain further, and I did not react. I simply noted it the way I had been noting everything, without expression, without urgency, and without forgetting. It was later that evening, while Olivia was upstairs and Daniel was in the garage, that I passed through the kitchen and stopped at the table. There was a manila folder lying open on it, angled toward the chair where I usually sat. I looked at it without touching it. The page it was open to had a header I recognized from the brochure Olivia had left in the bathroom 2 weeks before the facility on Maplewood. Below the header was a form with several fields already completed in Olivia's handwriting. My name, my date of birth, my current address. At the bottom, a signature line with a small printed label beneath it, resident. She had not even bothered to close the folder. I left the folder exactly as I found it. I did not move it, did not close it, did not give Olivia any reason to believe I had seen it at all. I walked back to my armchair and sat down and turned the television on, and I stayed there until the house went quiet for the night. But I had seen it, and I carried the image of that signature line, resident through every remaining hour of that evening, like a stone in my chest that I was not yet ready to set down. The appointment was announced the following morning. Olivia mentioned it over breakfast, with the casual confidence of someone delivering information rather than seeking approval. A new doctor, she said. Someone who specializes in care for older adults, very well regarded. She had taken the liberty of making the appointment for Thursday afternoon. She set a printed confirmation slip beside my coffee cup. The practice name on it meant nothing to me. I had not been consulted, had not been asked, had not been informed until the appointment was already made. I picked up the slip and read it slowly and said that Thursday would be fine. Daniel drove us there and sat in the waiting room while Olivia accompanied me inside. This was presented as consideration. She was there to help to remember details I might miss, to be an extra set of ears. The doctor was a pleasant man in his mid-50s with a calm, methodical manner and a small framed certificate on the wall that I made a point of reading from across the room. He began with routine questions: my sleep, my appetite, my daily routine, my ability to manage household tasks. And before I had finished answering the first one, Olivia had already begun elaborating. She did not interrupt exactly. She waited for the small, natural pauses in my speech and then expanded on them, redirecting the doctor's attention toward details. I had not offered a morning last week when I had apparently forgotten whether I had taken my medication. An afternoon when I had seemed disoriented coming in from the backyard, a pattern of repetition in my conversation that she described with gentle, regretful precision. Each detail was specific enough to sound like a memory and vague enough to be impossible to disprove. I answered the questions I was asked slowly, with occasional pauses, never wrong but never sharp. I gave the doctor a portrait of a man who was managing, but only just. There was a nurse in the room for part of the assessment. She came in to record my blood pressure and complete the intake paperwork, and she remained standing near the counter while Olivia spoke. Her name badge read Linda Carter. She was a composed woman somewhere around 50 with the unhurried efficiency of someone who had been doing this work for a long time and had learned to take in a room quickly. She did not watch me the way the doctor did, with professional attention and a pen ready. She watched Olivia. I noticed this the way I noticed most things in those days, without moving my eyes fully toward it, the way you watch something in your peripheral vision because looking directly at it might cause it to change. The doctor stepped out briefly to retrieve a form from the front desk, and Olivia followed him into the hallway to ask about parking validation. The moment the door closed, Nurse Linda moved. She crossed the room in 3 steps, and without a word, without any change in her expression, she pressed a small business card into my right hand. She held my gaze for exactly 1 second. Then she stepped back to her original position near the counter, and when Olivia returned 4 seconds later, Nurse Linda was writing something on the intake clipboard with the focused calm of a woman who had not moved at all. I closed my hand around the card and kept it there for the remainder of the appointment. In the car on the way home, Olivia sat in the front seat beside Daniel and mentioned pleasantly and without looking back at me that the doctor's office would be sending over some paperwork in the next few days. Just routine forms, she said. Nothing to worry about. I looked out the window at the passing streets and said nothing, and she did not seem to require a response. That night, the card in my pocket, I was sitting in the kitchen when my phone rang. The number matched what Linda Carter had pressed into my hand. Her voice, when I answered, was quiet and deliberate, the voice of someone who had chosen their words carefully before dialing. Someone in that office, she said, is trying to build a file that says you are no longer capable of making your own decisions. I have seen this before, Mr. Hayes. I thought you should know. I thanked Nurse Linda and sat with the phone in my hand for a long time after the call ended. The kitchen was dark except for the light above the stove, and the house was quiet in the way it only gets after 11, when even the ordinary sounds of other people's presence have settled into stillness. I thought about what she had said, not the warning itself, which I had already understood was coming, but the particular phrase she had used. I have seen this before. There was something in those 4 words that steadied me more than any reassurance could have. It meant I was not imagining things. It meant this had a shape that other people recognized. The following morning I called Andrew Collins. He had handled Helen's estate with the kind of quiet competence that never draws attention to itself, which is the highest compliment I know how to give a professional. He was in his late 40s, precise in his speech, and had a habit of listening to everything before he said anything, a quality rarer than it should be. I had not spoken to him at length since Helen's trust was finalized, but he answered my call as though no time had passed at all, and told me to come in the next afternoon with whatever documents I had access to. I brought what I had managed to gather over the preceding weeks, the bank statements I had quietly printed from the account. Olivia did not know. I still checked independently the resealed envelope from the correspondence I had discovered. Opened on the counter the appointment confirmation slip from the doctor's office, and a handwritten list of dates and observations I had been keeping in the back of a notebook I stored inside my copy of an old almanac on the shelf, a place I was reasonably confident no one had thought to look. Andrew spread everything across his desk and went through it without rushing. He asked several questions, made notes in the margin of a legal pad, and then opened his laptop and typed for a few minutes in silence. When he looked up, he set his pen down with the deliberate care of a man about to say something he wants to get exactly right. He had found a document filed 3 months earlier, a springing power of attorney bearing Daniel's signature. Under its terms, Daniel was granted authority over my financial and medical decisions, but the power could not be exercised until a licensed physician certified in writing that I lacked the capacity to manage my own affairs. Andrew explained this carefully, and without embellishment. The document was legal, properly witnessed, and entirely valid. Daniel had signed it 3 months ago, without telling me. I sat with that for a moment. Andrew was already pulling up something else. He had located the loan records I had not known to look for a debt in Daniel's name significant in amount already past its original repayment date. The creditor was listed as a private investment firm I did not recognize. Andrew typed the company name, waited, and then looked up at me across the desk. "Daniel," he said, and then caught himself remembering I was the one in the room. "The company that issued this loan, Gerald, it belongs to your wife's brother." The sentence arrived quietly, but it rearranged everything. I had spent the past several weeks constructing a picture of Olivia as someone who had seen an opportunity and moved toward it, a woman who had recognized vulnerability and decided to exploit it. That picture was not wrong, but it was incomplete, because what Andrew had just told me meant the opportunity had not been recognized. It had been manufactured. The loan that had driven Daniel into financial desperation, the debt that had made him feel he had no choices, left the pressure that had led him to sign a document he almost certainly told himself was only precautionary. All of it had been constructed deliberately, patiently from the inside. She had not married my son, and later decided to take advantage of his circumstances. She had created his circumstances. 2 years before any of this began, she had already known exactly where it would end. I looked at the document on Andrew's desk, Daniel's signature, neat and trusting at the bottom of the page, and I thought about my son standing in the living room saying nothing while his wife told me to crawl. He was not just complicit, he was also a casualty, and I did not think he knew it yet. Andrew gave me a moment which I appreciated. He was not the kind of man who filled silence unnecessarily, and I was not in a state that required filling. I sat across from him and looked at Daniel's signature on that document and understood that the anger I felt was not the clean, simple kind. It was the complicated kind, the kind that sits alongside grief rather than replacing it, because the person you are angry at is also someone you have loved for 42 years and cannot simply stop. After a while, Andrew moved on. There was more to cover, and he covered it with the same measured care he had brought to everything else. He walked me through the full structure of Helen's trust, not the summary version I had received when it was finalized, but the complete architecture of it, the way each provision connected to the next. The house was inside the trust. The investment accounts Helen had built over the course of our marriage quietly and consistently the way she did most things, those were inside the trust as well. Nothing held within it could be transferred, sold, or claimed without my explicit consent and a formal legal process that would take months and leave a clear trail. Helen had not simply protected our assets. She had built a structure that was designed to withstand exactly the kind of pressure that was currently being applied. And then Andrew paused and set down his pen. "There is one thing I need you to understand clearly," he said. "The trust protects the house and the investments. But your joint checking account, the one you and Helen opened together at the beginning, was never transferred into the trust. That account sits outside all of this. It is still in both your names, and with a valid power of attorney activated by a physician's certification, it can be accessed without your direct approval." He looked at me steadily. "That is where they will go first, Gerald. When they move, that is the account they will move against." I told him I understood. I asked him what else he had found, and he told me to wait because Margaret had just arrived. She came into Andrew's office with the particular purposefulness of someone who has spent the morning doing work that needed doing and has brought the results with her. She set a folder on the desk, sat down beside me, and did not waste time with preamble. The folder contained public records, the kind available to anyone willing to look, which most people never do. A marriage certificate filed in another county 7 years old, bearing Olivia's name and that of a man named Thomas Greer. A probate filing from 4 years ago in the same county documenting the estate of a man named Frank Greer, Thomas's father, 81 years old at the time of his death. Property transfer records showing that Frank Greer had signed over the deed to his home and liquidated 2 investment accounts in the 14 months before he died, transferring everything into a joint account with his son. Thomas and Olivia had divorced 11 months after Frank Greer passed away in a care facility outside of Raleigh. No charges had ever been filed. No one, as far as Margaret could determine, had ever asked a single question. The room was quiet for a moment after Margaret finished. "Gerald," she said, her voice careful in the way it gets when she is choosing precision over comfort, "this is not the first time she has done this." I looked at the marriage certificate. I looked at the probate filing. I thought about an 81-year-old man named Frank Greer signing his name on documents in the last year of his life, and I thought about what those final months must have looked like from the inside. The same warmth, the same performance, the same patient practiced erosion of everything he had built. I wondered if he had known what was happening. I wondered if anyone had believed him, if he had tried to say so. Andrew collected the documents carefully and closed the folder. Then he looked at me across the desk with the expression of a man who has something important to deliver and wants to deliver it correctly. "The no contest clause in Helen's trust," he said, "is unambiguous. Any beneficiary who attempts to obtain assets through coercion, fraud, or undue influence forfeits their claim entirely, not partially entirely." He let that settle. If they push you one more step in the direction they are already moving, they lose everything. "Gerald." He paused. "Helen made sure of that." I drove home from Andrew's office with the particular steadiness that comes not from the absence of fear, but from the presence of a plan. Helen had built something none of them knew existed, and the knowledge of it sat inside me like a foundation, solid, invisible, and entirely load-bearing. I did not change my behavior that evening. I ate dinner at the table with Daniel and Olivia, I answered questions in my usual measured way, and I went to bed at the same time I always did. The recorder went back into my breast pocket the following morning, as it did every morning, now a habit as routine as my coffee. Sunday came with clear skies, which in this part of the country in late autumn feels like a gift you did not expect and should not question. Olivia suggested church and the community lunch afterward, with the bright, organized energy she reserved for activities that took place in front of other people. Daniel said it sounded like a good idea. I said I would enjoy that, which was true, though not for any reason Olivia would have found reassuring. The fellowship hall was warm and loud in the comfortable way of rooms filled with people who have known one another long enough to talk across tables. I found my usual seat near the window and let the afternoon settle around me. The clatter of serving dishes, the particular cadence of congregation conversation, the smell of coffee that had been sitting too long and was better for it. Olivia moved through the room with the ease of someone who had studied it in advance. She was gracious with everyone, self-deprecating about the demands of caregiving in a way that invited sympathy without appearing to solicit it. and she kept one hand near my shoulder whenever anyone new approached, a gesture of devotion. So well placed, it would have moved me if I had not known what it cost her nothing to perform. I kept my hand near my breast pocket and let the recorder run. Toward the end of the meal, the tables began to thin. People drifted toward the exit in the unhurried way of Sunday afternoons, exchanging last remarks, retrieving coats. Olivia was at the far end of the hall near the dessert table, speaking with a woman I did not recognize, younger than Olivia, professional in her appearance, carrying a leather planner rather than a purse. They spoke with the focused calm of people conducting business in a social setting, which is to say they spoke quietly, stood close, and did not look around to see who might be listening. I watched without appearing to. The word I caught carried across the room during a brief lull in the surrounding conversation was assessment. Then a name I did not recognize. Then something that sounded like a timeline. Then Olivia laughed softly at something, and the ambient noise closed back over the exchange like water. It was enough. Pastor Grace Miller found me a few minutes later, settling into the chair beside mine with the unhurried ease of a woman who has nowhere more important to be. She is 60 years old and has led this congregation for 11 of them, and she possesses the particular quality of presence that makes people feel in her company that whatever they are carrying is something they are allowed to set down. For a moment, she asked how I was managing. I told her honestly that I was doing better than people seemed to expect. She folded her hands on the table and was quiet for a moment. Then she told me that Olivia had come to see her privately about a month ago. Olivia had asked her gently, and with every appearance of concern, whether she had noticed any changes in me lately, any confusion, any repetition, any signs that things were becoming difficult for me to follow. Pastor Grace looked at me steadily as she told me this. I told her she said that you are the most clear-headed person in this congregation. She paused. I thought you should know, she asked. I thanked her. I meant it fully. In the car on the way home, Olivia reached across and patted my hand without taking her eyes from the road. It was so good for you to get out today, Gerald, she said warmly, and with complete sincerity. That evening I sat alone and listened to the recording from start to finish, and I understood with a clarity that left no room for doubt that they had already drawn a map of my future. I just had not been invited to look at it. The week that followed the Sunday lunch had a surface calm that I had learned by then not to trust. Olivia was measured and pleasant in the way she always was when she believed things were proceeding correctly, and Daniel moved through the house with the careful quietness of a man who has convinced himself that not disturbing the water is the same thing as keeping the peace. I maintained my own performance with the same consistency I had brought to it from the beginning, slower in my movements, slightly delayed in my responses, present enough to require no concern but diminished enough to invite none. The recorder ran every day. I spoke to Margaret twice by phone and to Andrew once. I waited. The document appeared on a Tuesday morning. I had come into the kitchen for my coffee to find Olivia already seated at the table, dressed and composed, with a folder open in front of her and a pen laid precisely beside it. She looked up when I came in and smiled with the warmth she reserved for moments she had rehearsed. Daniel was standing near the doorway to the hallway, not quite in the room, his shoulder against the frame, his eyes on the floor with the studied neutrality of a man who has been told to be present, but not to participate. Olivia explained the documents with the smooth efficiency of someone who had thought carefully about the order in which to present the information. A healthcare proxy amendment routine, she said, simply updating the language to reflect current circumstances. And a financial management agreement, she added, which would allow for more efficient handling of household accounts, given everything I was managing. She used phrases like streamline and take the pressure off, and just a formality, really. And she delivered them with the gentle authority of someone doing a kindness that the recipient might not fully appreciate, but would certainly benefit from. I reached across and picked up the document. I held it the way I had been holding things for the past several weeks, with slightly loose fingers, reading slowly, my lips forming occasional words as though parsing the language cost me effort. I turned the first page with the careful deliberation of someone who was not entirely sure what they were looking for but was trying their best. I turned the second page. I found the signature line, picked up the pen, and signed on the line above the correct one, dated with the wrong month. I looked up at Olivia with the mild, cooperative expression of a man who had done his part. She looked at the signature. Something moved through her face, not anger, but the involuntary tightening of a person whose precise machinery has encountered unexpected resistance. It lasted less than 2 seconds. She took the document back with a small, smooth explanation about needing to have it reprinted with a minor correction, and she closed the folder with the practiced ease of someone who was already recalculating. I set the pen down and folded my hands on the table. Then I asked in the same mild and unhurried tone I had been using for weeks, the question that had been sitting in my chest since the evening. I found that intake form open on the kitchen table. "If I sign this," I said, "do I still come home every night?" The kitchen was very quiet. Daniel pushed himself off the door frame. He opened his mouth and I watched his face, watched him search for something adequate and find nothing, watched the words fail to arrive, watched him close his mouth again and look somewhere past my left shoulder, at a point on the wall that required his full attention. He did not answer. He could not answer. And in that silence I understood that some part of my son, buried beneath everything Olivia had built around him, already knew the answer was no. That night I sat alone in my room and found myself holding my phone without having made a conscious decision to pick it up. The screen showed a photograph of Helen from the summer before her diagnosis, standing in the backyard, one hand shading her eyes against the afternoon light, laughing at something I had said that I could no longer remember. I looked at her face for a long time, and then I heard her voice, not as imagination but as memory, precise and unhurried from a conversation near the end, when she had been tying things together with the quiet thoroughness that defined everything she did. "I have prepared everything, Gerald, for any situation. Whatever happens, you will not face it without something in your corner." I had assumed she meant the trust. I had not until that moment thought to wonder whether she had meant something more. I slept better that night than I had in weeks, which surprised me when I woke to find the room already light. There is something in the act of asking a direct question, even one that goes unanswered, that loosens a knot you have been carrying without knowing how tight it had become. I lay still for a few minutes listening to the house, and then I got up and made my coffee and took it out to the back steps. The garden was quiet in the particular way of late autumn mornings, when the light comes in low and everything it touches looks like it is resting rather than dying. Helen's roses had gone to their winter state, stripped back, thorny, patient. I had cut them the week before, finally, the way she had always done it in October, and they looked better for it in the spare, structural way that pruned things do. I sat with my coffee and did not think about documents or attorneys or the folder on the kitchen table. I thought about Helen standing in that same garden with her sleeves rolled up and her hair coming loose, telling me the names of things I kept forgetting. I thought that she would have known exactly what to do with all of this, and then I thought that she had, and that the knowing of it was still settling into me in layers. I went back inside when the coffee was finished. Olivia was in the kitchen, and she told me we would be going for a drive that afternoon. Her tone was the pleasant, managing tone she used when decisions had already been made, and she was presenting them as suggestions out of courtesy rather than necessity. She said there was a place she thought I might like to see. She said it with a smile that did not reach her eyes. The facility on Maplewood was neither cruel nor neglectful, which in some ways made it harder to look at than if it had been. It was clean and adequately staffed and decorated in the particular way of places that have thought carefully about the appearance of comfort without quite achieving its substance. Soft colors, framed prints of landscapes no one had ever visited, furniture arranged to suggest community while actually enforcing distance. The coordinator who met us at the entrance had a practiced warmth that I recognized from Olivia's own repertoire, and she guided us through the hallways with the smooth efficiency of someone who has given this particular tour many times. Daniel walked beside Olivia and nodded at intervals that had nothing to do with what was being said. He asked 2 questions, both of them practical, both of them the questions of a man executing a plan rather than evaluating one. I walked slowly and looked at everything and said very little. We passed the common room on the way back from the residential wing. It was a large, adequately lit space with tables arranged near the windows and a television mounted high on the far wall. Most of the chairs were empty at this hour. In one near the window sat a man who I estimated to be in his mid-80s, dressed with a precision that spoke of old habit, a pressed collared shirt, trousers, with a crease hair combed with care. He was looking at nothing in particular. There was no book on the table in front of him, no cup, no phone. No one came to sit with him while we stood in the doorway. No one appeared to be coming. I looked at that man for a moment. Then I looked at Daniel. Something moved behind my son's eyes when he saw him, a brief involuntary recognition there, and gone the way a person flinches at something before they have decided whether to acknowledge it. He turned away quickly and directed his attention back to the coordinator's remarks about the dining schedule. Near the end of the tour, a social worker paused beside me in the corridor while Olivia and Daniel were examining a room at the far end of the hall. She spoke quietly and with careful neutrality, as people do when they are saying something that matters within the limits of their professional position. She mentioned that residents always retain the right to decline admission. She did not elaborate. I thanked her, and she moved on. In the parking lot, Olivia checked something on her phone while Daniel brought the car around. When we were settled inside and pulling onto the road, she glanced at her screen and said, without looking up, "We can have everything arranged by Friday." I looked out the window at the passing streets and said nothing. But somewhere between that parking lot and my front door, the fear that had been sitting in my chest for weeks quietly stepped aside, and something steadier and more useful moved in to take its place. Friday. I had 4 days, and I intended to use every one of them. I spent Monday and Tuesday moving carefully through the house, with the same unhurried performance I had maintained for weeks, but beneath it, I was working with a focus I had not felt since the years when I was still running the business, and everything depended on getting the sequence right. I spoke with Margaret by phone each evening after Olivia and Daniel had gone upstairs. I confirmed details with Andrew. I kept the recorder running and said nothing that was not precisely what I intended to say. Wednesday morning, I woke early, made my coffee, and sat down at the kitchen table with my laptop to check the joint account before anyone else was up. The browser loaded the bank's login page. I entered my credentials, and the screen returned a message I had not seen before: access suspended pending account review. For assistance, please contact your branch directly. I read it twice. I set the coffee cup down. I called Andrew at 7:45. He answered on the second ring, which told me he had been expecting to hear from me. He was quiet for a moment after I told him what the screen said. Then he spoke in the measured, unrushed tone of a man delivering difficult information with the care it deserved. The doctor from the appointment the previous week, he explained, had signed and submitted the competency certification. Olivia had filed the documentation against the springing power of attorney the previous afternoon and had used the activated POA to initiate a freeze on the joint checking account that morning. She had moved faster than Andrew had anticipated, which he said without apology and without excuse, because he was not the kind of man who offered either when a plain account of facts was what the situation required. "We have approximately 72 hours, he said, before she files for full legal guardianship. Once that petition is entered, the process becomes significantly more complicated to reverse, even with everything we have. Gerald, whatever we are going to do, we do it now." I told him I understood. I told him I would call him back within the hour. Then I sat at the kitchen table with the phone face down in front of me and the locked account still open on the laptop screen, and I allowed myself exactly the amount of time it took to finish my coffee to sit with the full weight of sometimes what was happening. Then I stood up and went to the hallway closet. On the top shelf behind a box of Helen's winter things I had not yet found the right moment to sort through, there was a shoebox I had put there myself. The month after she passed her smaller things, the items that had lived on her nightstand, and in her desk drawer, the ones too personal to give away and too present to keep in plain sight, while I was still learning how to be in the house without her. I brought it down and carried it to the kitchen table. I went through it the way you go through things that belong to someone you loved, slowly, and with the particular attention of a person who understands that nothing in the box is ordinary. A photograph from our first anniversary, a letter from her sister folded and refolded along old creases, a small notebook with her handwriting on the cover, and at the very bottom beneath everything else, a USB drive in a sealed envelope with her name written on the outside in the careful, deliberate hand she used when something mattered. On the front of the envelope, in the same hand, 4 words: "For Gerald, only if needed." I looked at it for a long moment. Then I opened the envelope, plugged the drive into my laptop, and waited. Her face appeared on the screen. She had filmed it 18 months before she died, when she was still entirely herself, her posture straight, her eyes clear, her voice carrying the same unhurried precision she had brought to every important thing she had ever said to me. She looked directly into the camera, and the quality of her attention was so complete and so familiar that for a moment the kitchen, the locked account, the 72 hours, all of it receded entirely. "Gerald," she said, "if you are watching this, then what I was afraid of has already started. I want you to know I saw it. I have been watching longer than you know, and I made sure you would not face this alone." She told me about the trust. She told me about the no contest clause and what it meant, and exactly when it would apply. She gave me Andrew's direct number, which she had written on a card inside the filing cabinet in the second drawer. She described its location with the precision of someone who understood that the details were the thing. She told me about a folder of documents she had prepared and left with Andrew herself, sealed to be opened only in this circumstance. She looked into the camera and did not look away. "Don't let them take what we built together," she said. "I did not spend 44 years building a life with you just to have someone walk in and dismantle it. You are not alone in this, Gerald. Fight. I will be right there with you." I watched it 3 times. Then I picked up the phone and called Margaret. When she answered, I said only, "It is time. Set the table." Margaret said nothing for a moment after I spoke. Then she said, "Thursday evening. I will call the others." I told her Friday, 7 o'clock at the house. She said she would handle it. That was all either of us needed to say. I made the remaining calls myself. Andrew first, who confirmed he could be there and said he would bring the sealed folder Helen had left with him, the one she had prepared and signed in the final year of her life, which he had been holding against exactly this kind of moment. Then Nurse Linda, who listened without interruption and said yes without hesitation in the tone of someone who had been waiting to be asked. Then Pastor Grace, who said she would bring nothing except herself, which I told her was more than enough. Wednesday passed. Thursday passed. I moved through both days with the same careful performance I had maintained since the beginning, unhurried, slightly vague at the edges, requiring no particular concern. Olivia spent Thursday afternoon on the phone in her office with the door partially closed, and I heard enough through the gap to understand she was confirming arrangements. She used the word Friday more than once. She sounded confident in the way that people sound when they believe the most difficult part is already behind them. She was not wrong about that exactly. The difficult part was nearly over. She had simply misunderstood for whom. Friday morning, I waited until both of them had left the house, Olivia to run what she described as a few errands, Daniel to the office for a half day he clearly did not want to take but had been directed to take. When the car had been gone long enough, I went to the kitchen and began. I cooked the way Helen had taught me to cook, which is to say, slowly and without shortcuts, and with the understanding that the meal is not only what ends up on the plate, but everything that goes into the making of it. I prepared the pot roast she had always made for occasions that mattered, the recipe written in her hand on an index card that lived in the tin box above the refrigerator. I set the table with her good dishes, the ones kept in the cabinet we never opened for ordinary dinners, and I found the linen tablecloth she had pressed and folded into the bottom drawer of the sideboard, and I spread it across the table, the way I had watched her do it 100 times, smoothing the corners with the flat of my hand. At some point in the middle of the afternoon, standing at the stove with the light coming through the kitchen window, at the angle it takes in late autumn, I found myself talking to her. Not performing, not rehearsing, just talking in the easy and unhurried way of a man speaking to someone who has always known how to listen. I told her I understood now why she had prepared everything so carefully. I told her I was not afraid. I told her I thought she would have enjoyed this particular evening very much. Olivia came home first. She stopped in the kitchen doorway, and her expression moved through surprise, and then recalibrated into something more careful, pleasant, but watchful. She looked at the table, at the good dishes, at the pot on the stove, and then at me. "Gerald," she said, with the measured warmth of someone buying time while they assess a situation, "you didn't have to do all of this." I smiled at her with the mild and cooperative expression she had come to expect. "I wanted to," I said. "We should celebrate while we are all still here together." I turned back to the stove before she could read my face too closely. She accepted it. She had no reason not to. And she began moving around the kitchen with her usual efficient grace, finding the wine glasses, arranging them just so, straightening things that did not need straightening. Daniel came home 20 minutes later and stopped in the doorway the way he sometimes did when he entered a room and found it different from how he had left it. He stood there with his keys in his hand, and I watched him feel something he could not name, some shift in the atmosphere that his instincts registered before his mind could catch up. He set his keys down slowly and did not say what he was thinking. He should have listened to that instinct. Margaret arrived at 5 minutes to 7 with the quiet punctuality of someone who understands that timing is its own form of preparation. Andrew came 2 minutes after carrying a leather briefcase I had not seen before, and he set it beside his chair without comment or explanation. Nurse Linda arrived next in the composed and unhurried way she seemed to do everything, and Pastor Grace came last, pausing in the doorway for just a moment to take in the room before she stepped fully inside. I had placed them deliberately, Margaret to my left, Andrew to my right, Nurse Linda and Pastor Grace across, so that the table when it was full would feel like what it was, a room in which everyone present understood the purpose of the evening, except for the two people who were about to find out. Olivia had changed into something more formal than her afternoon clothes. She had refreshed her makeup and put on the small silver earrings she wore when she wanted to make a particular impression. She came down the stairs and into the dining room and read the assembled faces with the rapid practiced assessment of a woman accustomed to entering rooms and immediately understanding them. Something crossed her expression quick and unreadable before she arranged it into warmth and extended her hand toward Margaret with a graciousness that cost her nothing. Daniel sat beside her and poured the wine, and for a while the dinner was on its surface exactly what it appeared to be. The food was good, the conversation moved, and Olivia performed with a fluency I had come to think of as her highest gear, attentive to Andrew, deferential to Pastor Grace, including Nurse Linda, with the particular care of someone who had intuited that Linda was not entirely in her corner, and had decided that the correct response was extra effort rather than caution. She laughed at the right moments. She asked questions that showed she had been listening. She was, by every observable measure, the devoted and capable daughter-in-law, managing an increasingly difficult situation with grace and love, and no small amount of personal sacrifice. I ate slowly and said very little, which no one at that table found unusual for different reasons. Somewhere between the main course and the moment when the table had settled into the comfortable pause of a meal mostly finished, Olivia began. It was almost imperceptible the way a conversation shifts when someone who has been waiting their turn finally decides the moment has arrived. She spoke about my health with tender concern, about the increasing difficulty of full-time care, about the conversations she and Daniel had been having reluctantly and lovingly, about what would be best for everyone going forward. Her voice carried exactly the right weight of regret. Her logic was clean and sequential, and presented with the confidence of a woman who had rehearsed it until it felt like conviction. She was in the telling of it selfless and clear-eyed and entirely right, and the version of me inside her story was a man who needed to be looked after, who could no longer manage, who would be better served somewhere with professional support and structured care. She was explaining why she was the person who loved me most. I set my fork down and looked at her. "Olivia," I said in the same mild and unhurried tone I had been using for weeks in all of this, "did you ever once ask me what I wanted?" The table went very quiet. She recovered in under 2 seconds, which I noted as the specific skill it was. She said, of course, that everything she had done had been with my wishes at heart, that this was all for my benefit, that she and Daniel had only ever wanted what was best for me. The words were good words. She had used them before and they had always worked before, but something had changed in the room. I could feel it in the way Andrew's hand moved to the top of his briefcase, in the way Nurse Linda's hand settled and stilled in her lap, in the way Pastor Grace lowered her head slightly as a person does before something they know is coming and have already made their peace with. Margaret reached into her bag. She placed a small digital recorder at the center of the table and looked at Olivia with the steady, patient expression of a woman who has been waiting a long time for this particular moment to arrive. "Before we go any further," she said, "I think everyone at this table should hear something." Olivia's eyes moved to the recorder with the controlled attention of someone who does not want to appear concerned and is not quite succeeding. Daniel's hand stopped moving on the stem of his wine glass. Margaret pressed play without preamble or explanation, and Olivia's voice filled the dining room. It was the recording from Sunday lunch, the exchange I had captured near the dessert table while she spoke with the woman carrying the leather planner. In the quiet of the dining room, every word arrived with a clarity. The ambient noise of the fellowship hall had partially obscured when I first heard it. The timeline, the assessment already confirmed. The facility on Maplewood described as secured. The joint account identified by institution and approximate balance. And beneath all of it, in the tone and the structure and the confidence of the thing, the unmistakable quality of a plan in its final stages, not a plan being considered, but a plan being reported on. Olivia said nothing while it played. She sat with her hands flat on the table, and her face arranged in an expression I had not seen from her before because it was not performed. It was the expression of someone calculating in real time how much damage has been done and whether any of it can still be managed. Margaret stopped the recording. Andrew opened his briefcase. He laid the documents on the table with the methodical care of a man who understands that the order of information is its own form of argument. First, the trust. He walked through the no contest clause in plain language without legal abstraction, what it said, what it required, what had now been satisfied. The springing power of attorney that had been activated using a fraudulent competency certification constituted under the terms Helen had written into the trust with precise and unambiguous intent, an act of undue influence against grantor. The clause had been triggered. Whatever claim Olivia and Daniel had held as beneficiaries had ceased to exist at the moment the POA was filed. Then Andrew set a second document beside the first, the marriage certificate, the probate filing, the property transfer records from another county 4 years old bearing the name Frank Greer. He did not narrate them at length. He simply placed them where everyone at the table could see them and let them say what they said. Olivia looked at the records for a long moment. For the first time in all the weeks I had been watching her, she had nothing to offer, no pivot, no reframe, no version of events that recast the evidence as something else. She looked at them and said nothing, and the silence was its own kind of answer. Nurse Linda spoke next, and she spoke quietly but without hesitation. She described what she had observed during the medical appointment, the way questions had been shaped, the way my responses had been supplemented and redirected, the way the assessment had been steered toward a predetermined conclusion. She had already, she said, filed a formal report with the state's Adult Protective Services Division and with the medical board. The certification the doctor had signed was under review. Daniel made a sound that was not quite a word. I stood up from the table. I crossed to the sideboard where I had placed my laptop earlier in the evening, already open, already connected to the television mounted on the dining room wall. I had set it up that afternoon while the pot roast was in the oven and the house was quiet, moving through each step with the careful patience of a man who needed to be certain it would work. I pressed play and stepped back. Helen's face appeared on the screen. The room went completely still. She looked directly into the camera with the full and unhurried attention that had always been one of the things I loved most about her, the quality of presence that made you feel whenever she looked at you that you were the only thing in her field of vision. She spoke clearly and without hesitation, and every word landed in the silence of the dining room with the weight of something that had been prepared with great care and great love for exactly this moment. No one moved while she spoke. Not Olivia, not Daniel, not any of the people seated around that table who had come knowing what this evening was. When she finished, I reached over and turned off the screen. I looked at Olivia across the table, and I did not raise my voice because I did not need to. The silence after I turned off the screen lasted long enough to become its own kind of verdict. Olivia sat with her hands still flat on the table, and I watched her reach one final time for the version of herself that had always been able to find a way through. She straightened slightly. She took a breath. And then she said in a tone that was measured and calm, and entirely without the warmth she had performed for so many weeks, that she thought perhaps everyone was being hasty, that there was clearly some misunderstanding here, that she was certain if they all took a step back and looked at this, reasonably they would find that her intentions had always been what she had said they were, and that she was open to revisiting the conversation in a more constructive setting. Andrew stopped her with the quiet efficiency of a man who has been waiting for exactly this moment and has no interest in prolonging it. He explained in 2 sentences what the activated springing power of attorney filed under a fraudulent competency certification meant under state law. He did not use language designed to wound. He used language designed to be precise, which in this circumstance amounted to the same thing. The civil exposure was significant. The Adult Protective Services report Nurse Linda had already filed would trigger its own separate process. The no contest clause in Helen's trust was not a threat or a negotiating position. It was a provision that had already been satisfied by the actions taken over the preceding weeks, and it was not reversible. Olivia looked at him for a moment. Then she looked at the table. Andrew set the probate records from the Frank Greer estate directly in front of her. The marriage certificate, the property transfer, the care facility records. He did not speak. He simply placed them where she could see them and left them there. She did not look at them for long. She did not offer an explanation, did not attempt a reframe, did not produce an alternative account of what the documents showed. She looked at them, and then she looked away, and in that turning away I saw the thing I had been watching for without knowing I was watching for at the moment when there was nothing left to perform. No warmth, no logic, no story, in which she was still the most reasonable person in the room. Just a woman sitting at a table that had run out of options. I looked at my son. Daniel had not spoken since Nurse Linda finished. He was sitting very still with his hands in his lap and his eyes on the middle distance between himself and the far wall, and he looked like a man who has been standing in a building for a long time without realizing it was the wrong one, and has just understood where he is. I did not need to say a great deal. I said that I needed them to leave the house that night, and I said it in the same tone I had used for everything else, without anger, without drama, with the plain and settled authority of a man speaking about something that has already been decided. Olivia stood first. She went upstairs and I heard drawers, and then the sound of a bag being moved, and then her steps on the stairs again. She came through the dining room without looking at anyone at the table, and went directly to the front door and opened it and walked through it without turning around. Not once. The door did not slam. It closed with the quiet final sound of something that is simply over. Daniel followed 10 minutes later. He came downstairs with a bag and walked to the front door and stopped. He turned and looked at me, not at the table, not at the others, directly at me, and his face held everything he did not have the words for yet. I held his gaze. I did not speak, and neither did he. Then he walked out and the door closed behind him in the same quiet way. The days that followed moved with a speed and a clarity that felt like the release of a pressure I had been holding for so long I had forgotten it was there. Andrew filed the necessary paperwork within 24 hours. The springing power of attorney was legally voided. The freeze on the joint checking account was lifted. The no contest clause in Helen's trust was formally triggered and entered into the record. The facility on Maplewood received a withdrawal of the intake paperwork that bore my name. 3 days later, a car pulled into the driveway. One door opened. Daniel got out alone. I watched him from the front window for a moment before I opened the door. This son of mine, 42 years old, standing beside his car in the driveway with no particular expression on his face. Just a man standing in a place he was no longer certain he was welcome. I opened the door before he reached the porch. I did not say anything. I simply stepped back and let him in. He sat at the kitchen table, the same table where this had all unfolded, where the folder had been left open, where Olivia had set the pen beside the documents with such practiced precision. He sat with both hands around a cup of coffee I had poured without asking whether he wanted it, because he is my son, and I know how he takes his coffee, and some things do not change regardless of what passes between people. He did not ask for forgiveness. I respected him for that more than I expected to. A man who begins with a request for absolution is really asking for his own comfort rather than offering anything to the person he wronged, and Daniel, whatever else he had become in those years, still understood enough about honesty to know that forgiveness is not the first thing you ask for. It is the last thing, and only after you have earned the right to ask it. What he gave me instead was the account of it, the full account told without softening or omission. The investment opportunity Olivia's brother had presented 3 years earlier, framed as something Daniel would have been foolish to pass up. The way the terms had shifted, gradually small adjustments that each seemed reasonable in isolation and were ruinous in accumulation. The loan that followed from the same firm offered as a solution to the problem it had created. The documents he had signed at Olivia's suggestion, including the springing power of attorney, because she had told him it was standard estate planning, because he had believed her, because he had needed by that point to believe her about something. I didn't see it, he said. He looked at the table. I should have. I looked at my son for a long time. I thought about the man in the common room at the Maplewood facility, sitting alone in a pressed collared shirt with no one coming. I thought about Frank Greer, whose name I had never known until Margaret found it in a public record, and who had died in a place not unlike that one. I thought about what it means to be seen by the people who are supposed to see you, and what it costs when they look away. I know, I said. I saw it. I just needed you to see it too. We did not resolve everything that morning. Some things do not resolve in a morning or a season, or perhaps ever entirely. What we did was begin carefully, without pretense, with the particular honesty of two people who have run out of the easier options. It was not comfortable. It was real, which is the thing that matters and is harder to find than people expect. 2 weeks later, I called Andrew and told him what I had decided to do with the house. He was quiet for a moment on the other end of the line, and then he said he would draw up the paperwork. It took 6 weeks to arrange the legal transfer, the non-profit designation, the structural assessment, the conversations with the county about permitted use. I was involved in every step, which Andrew had the good sense not to suggest was unnecessary. I had spent enough of the preceding months being managed by people who thought they understood my situation better than I did. I was not inclined to extend that arrangement to anyone. The sign went up on a Thursday morning in early spring. I stood at the front door of the house and read it from the porch, the same doorframe I had gripped on bad mornings, the same threshold Helen had crossed 10,000 times over 44 years. White letters on a dark background, clean and permanent. Helen Hayes Community Center. I put my hand flat against the frame and stood there for a while without speaking. The garden was beginning again, the roses putting out their first cautious growth, the beds Helen had designed, coming back to themselves the way they did every year, patient and entirely reliable. Then I went inside and put the kettle on and called Margaret to tell her it was done. They had come for this house. Instead, it became the place that proved to every person who would walk through that door that growing old does not mean disappearing. Helen had always known that. She had spent her whole life knowing it. I had simply finally caught up with her. And that is where Gerald's story ends, not in bitterness, not in loss, but in something far more enduring than either of those things. I want to take a moment before we close today to share what this story means to me personally, because I think about it long after the telling is finished. What strikes me most is not the betrayal, as painful as it was, and not even the justice, as satisfying as it was. What stays with me is Helen, a woman who saw what was coming, who said nothing that would cause alarm, and who quietly built a wall around the person she loved most before she left. That is not luck. That is a lifetime of paying attention to the people who matter. The lesson I take from Gerald's story is this: dignity does not disappear with age, and silence is not the same as consent. If you are watching this and something in Gerald's situation feels familiar, a parent, a grandparent, a neighbor whose circumstances seem to be shifting in ways that don't feel right, please do not look away. Ask the question. Make the call. Be the person who notices. And if you are in Gerald's position yourself, know that being older does not mean being without options. Document everything. Talk to someone you trust, and never sign anything you have not read in full and understood completely. Now, I want to hear from you. Does this story remind you of someone you know or something you have witnessed? Leave your thoughts in the comments below, because your perspective matters here, and every story shared in this community helps someone else feel less alone. If this moved you, please subscribe so you never miss what we share next. We will see you in the next story.